The fluorescent lights of Riverside Police Department flickered as Jake Martinez burst through the glass doors, his 12-year-old legs giving out from exhaustion as he stumbled forward. Blood stained his Superman t-shirt, his hands trembling, as he cradled his 6-year-old sister Sophie against his chest. Her small body was limp, crimson, seeping through the makeshift bandage he'd torn from his own jacket sleeve. "Help us!" His voice cracked, desperation echoing through the station. "Lobby, please, somebody help my sister." Sergeant Williams looked up from his paperwork, his 25 years of service having prepared him for many things, but not the sight of a child carrying another child, both covered in blood, both bearing the weight of something no child should ever carry. But this story doesn't begin in that moment of crisis. It begins 3 months earlier in apartment 2B of Cedar Grove Apartments, where 12-year-old Jake Martinez was learning lessons no 6th grader should have to master. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness of apartment 2B, but Jake Martinez was already awake. At 12 years old, he had developed the internal clock of someone far older, his body automatically stirring at 5:30 each morning before his mother Carmen left for her opening shift at Mel's 24-hour diner. The routine had become sacred. To him, these 15 minutes when he could pretend they were a normal family, when the weight of responsibility felt lighter. Jake padded quietly to the kitchen of their small 2-bedroom apartment, careful not to wake Sophie, who was curled up in the bottom bunk of their shared room. The coffee maker gurgled to life as he prepared his mother's travel mug, adding exactly 2 sugars and a splash of the vanilla creamer she loved, but claimed was too expensive to buy regularly. These small luxuries had become Jake's secret contributions to their household, purchased with money he earned, helping Mr. Rossi stock shelves at the corner market after school. Carmen Martinez emerged from her bedroom, her Mel's Diner uniform. Crisp, despite being washed and reworn countless times. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but she smiled when she saw Jake standing by the counter with her coffee prepared exactly the way she liked it. At 34, Carmen carried herself with the determined grace of someone who had learned to shoulder burdens alone. Her husband's departure 3 years earlier, having forced her into a role she never wanted but had mastered out of necessity. "Morning, mijo," she whispered, accepting the coffee mug with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. "You don't have to do this every morning." "I know," Jake replied, but they both understood that these morning rituals were less about necessity and more about connection. In the 15 minutes before Carmen left for work, they existed in a bubble where she was just his mom and he was just her son, not the co-parent he'd become by default. Through the thin walls of Cedar Grove Apartments, they could hear Mrs. Henderson's alarm clock buzzing next door, followed by the sound of her voice, coaxing Tyler and Emma awake for school. The Henderson family lived in apartment 2A, their morning chaos a stark contrast to the quiet efficiency Jake had developed. Linda Henderson worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, her flexible schedule allowing her to be present for her children in ways Carmen envied but never resented. Carmen glanced at the kitchen clock, knowing she had exactly 12 minutes before she needed to leave to catch the bus to downtown Riverside. "Sophie's lunch money is on the counter," he said, though Jake already knew this. "Mrs. Henderson said she'd walk both of you to school if you want." Jake nodded, though he and Sophie rarely took Mrs. Henderson up on her offer, not out of pride, but because Jake had noticed how Tyler and Emma sometimes looked embarrassed when their mother paid extra attention to the Martinez children, and he didn't want to create tension between families who were all just trying to survive. The sound of small feet hitting the hardwood floor announced Sophie's awakening. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her long dark hair tangled from sleep, clutching the stuffed elephant their father had given her before he left. Mr. Peanuts had seen better days, his grey fabric worn thin from constant companionship. But Sophie refused to sleep without him. "Morning, baby girl," Carmen said, kneeling to embrace her daughter. Sophie, still groggy, melted into her mother's arms with the complete trust that only 6-year-olds possessed. Jake watched this interaction with the protective intensity he'd developed over the past year, cataloguing his sister's mood, her energy level, any signs that she might need extra attention during the day. Carmen's phone buzzed with a text message, and Jake saw her shoulders tense as she read it. He couldn't see the screen, but he recognized the expression that crossed her mother's face. The look she got when Mel's diner called with schedule changes, usually meaning longer hours or additional shifts they couldn't afford to refuse. "Everything okay, Mom?" Jake asked, though he was already mentally preparing for whatever adjustment their routine would require. "Just work stuff," Carmen replied. But Jake caught the way she glanced toward the pile of bills on the kitchen counter, the red stamps visible even from where he stood. "I might be home a little later tonight. Can you handle dinner?" Jake had been handling dinner for the better part of 6 months, ever since Carmen started picking up evening shifts to supplement their income. He'd taught himself to cook using YouTube videos and library books, becoming proficient at stretching cheap ingredients into meals that would keep him and Sophie fed until their mother returned home, often after 10 o'clock. "No problem," Jake said, and he meant it. Cooking had become another way he could contribute to their family's survival, another skill in his growing arsenal of premature adulthood. Carmen kissed both children goodbye, her lips lingering on Sophie's forehead as if trying to absorb enough of her daughter's presence to sustain her through another long day. Jake walked her to the door, accepting the brief hug she gave him, the kind of embrace that communicated gratitude, love, and apology all at once. After their mother left, Jake and Sophie settled into their own morning routine. Jake prepared Sophie's breakfast while she got dressed, helping her choose clothes that matched and braiding her hair the way Carmen had taught him. Sophie chatted about her upcoming show-and-tell presentation, her excitement infectious, as she described the rock collection she'd been gathering from the playground at Lincoln Elementary. "Jake, do you think Mr. Peanuts wants to come to school today?" Sophie asked, holding up her elephant. Jake considered this carefully. Sophie had been taking Mr. Peanuts to school more frequently lately, a sign that she was feeling anxious about something she couldn't articulate. Rather than discourage the habit, Jake had learned to read these signals as indicators of his sister's emotional state. "I think Mr. Peanuts would love to hear about rocks," Jake said, earning a brilliant smile from Sophie. As they prepared to leave for school, Jake performed his mental checklist. Backpacks packed, lunch money secured, Sophie's inhaler in the outer pocket of her bag where she could reach it easily. Sophie had mild asthma, nothing serious according to the doctor they'd seen at the free clinic, but Jake had memorized the signs of an attack and kept her rescue inhaler close at all times. The walk to Lincoln Elementary took them through the heart of their neighborhood, past Mr. Rossi's corner market, where Jake would stop after school to earn spending money, past the community center where Carmen sometimes attended free parenting, classes on her days off, past the small houses and apartment complexes that housed families much like their own, hard-working, struggling, but determined to create better lives for their children. Jake noticed everything during these walks: which neighbors seemed to be having financial difficulties, which elderly residents might need help with groceries, which younger children appeared to be spending too much time unsupervised. This hypervigilance had developed gradually, born from his deep-seated need to understand and predict the challenges that might affect his family's stability. At school, Jake walked Sophie to her first-grade classroom, waiting until she was settled at her desk before heading to his own sixth-grade class. Mrs. Patterson, Sophie's teacher, always greeted Jake with warm recognition, understanding without being told that he was more than just Sophie's big brother. He was often her primary advocate and protector during school hours. Jake's own academic performance had become a careful balancing act. He was naturally intelligent, but the mental energy required to manage household responsibilities and worry about his family's well-being sometimes left him exhausted during class. His teachers had begun to notice, though none had yet connected his occasional fatigue to the adult responsibilities he shouldered at home. During lunch, Jake made it a point to check on Sophie, usually finding her playing with Emma Henderson or sitting quietly with her rock collection. He'd learned to read her body language from across the playground, able to distinguish between normal 6-year-old moodiness and the signs that she was feeling overwhelmed or missing their mother. After school, Jake and Sophie walked home together, stopping at Mr. Rossi's market where Jake worked for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story for an hour. Stocking shelves and helping elderly customers while Sophie did homework at a small table Mr. Rossi had set up in the back of the store. Frank Rossi, a 70-year-old Italian immigrant who'd owned the market for 40 years, had developed a soft spot for the Martinez children, often sending them home with groceries that were about to expire, but were actually perfectly fresh. "You're a good boy, Jake," Mr. Rossi would say, pressing an extra $5 bill into Jake's hand. "Your mama, she's raising you right." Jake treasured these moments of adult approval, though he sometimes wondered what Mr. Rossi would think if he knew the full extent of Jake's responsibilities at home. The truth was that Jake had become expert at presenting a version of their life that appeared normal from the outside, protecting both his mother's pride and his family's privacy. Evenings in apartment 2B followed a rhythm Jake had perfected. Through trial and error, homework first, then dinner preparation, then quiet activities that would keep Sophie entertained until bedtime. Jake had learned to cook simple but nutritious meals: spaghetti with homemade sauce, chicken and rice, grilled cheese and soup, stretching their grocery budget while ensuring Sophie got the nutrition she needed for healthy growth. Bath time was perhaps Jake's biggest challenge, requiring him to supervise Sophie while maintaining her privacy and dignity. He'd learned to run the bathwater to the perfect temperature, to help her wash her hair without getting soap in her eyes, to make the routine feel like play rather than a chore. Sophie never complained about these arrangements, accepting Jake's care with the natural adaptability of children who learn early that families come in many different configurations. Bedtime stories were Jake's favorite part of their evening routine. He'd discovered that Sophie fell asleep more easily when he read to her, his voice providing the comfort and security she needed to settle into peaceful dreams. Jake had become an expert at animated reading, creating different voices for story characters and making even familiar tales feel new and exciting. After Sophie fell asleep, Jake would tackle his own homework, often working at the kitchen table, by the light of the overhead fixture, while listening for any sounds that might indicate Sophie was having trouble sleeping. These late-night study sessions had become his norm, the quiet hours after bedtime providing the only time he could focus completely on his own academic needs. By the time Carmen returned home from her evening shift, usually around 10:30, Jake had completed his homework, prepared everything needed for the next morning, and was ready to provide his mother with a brief report on Sophie's day. These conversations were important to all of them. Carmen needed to maintain her connection to her children's daily lives, and Jake needed the reassurance that came from sharing responsibility, even if only verbally. "How was school?" Carmen would ask, settling onto the couch with the exhaustion of someone who'd been on her feet for 14 hours. Jake would tell her about Sophie's show-and-tell presentation, about the math test he'd taken, about the small victories and minor challenges that comprised their daily existence. Carmen would listen with the focused attention of a parent, trying to absorb every detail, her questions revealing how much she valued these glimpses into the lives she was missing during her long work hours. But lately, Jake had begun to notice changes in their routine that worried him. Carmen's work schedule had become increasingly unpredictable, with more double shifts and emergency calls to cover for absent co-workers. The bills on the kitchen counter seemed to multiply faster than they disappeared, and Jake had overheard phone conversations that suggested their landlord was losing patience with late rent payments. More concerning to Jake were the subtle changes he observed in Sophie. She'd begun having more frequent nightmares, waking up crying for their mother who wasn't there. Her appetite had decreased slightly, and she'd started asking questions about their father that Jake struggled to answer honestly. 6-year-olds, Jake had learned, were remarkably intuitive about family stress, even when adults tried to shield them from it. One evening in late October, as Jake was helping Sophie with a puzzle after dinner, she looked up at him with the serious expression she wore when processing something important. "Jake, are we poor?" she asked, her small fingers still working to fit a puzzle piece into place. The question caught Jake off guard, though he realized he'd been expecting it eventually. Sophie was observant, and she'd certainly noticed the differences between their family's lifestyle and those of her classmates who had both parents at home, who took family vacations, who never seemed to worry about whether they could afford new shoes when their old ones wore out. "We're not rich," Jake said carefully, "but we have everything we need. Mom works really hard to take care of us." Sophie nodded, accepting this explanation with the trust she placed in Jake's version of their reality. But Jake could see her, processing this information, filing it away with all the other observations she was making about their family's circumstances. That night, after Sophie was asleep and Carmen had returned from work, Jake found himself lying awake, thinking about his sister's question. They weren't technically poor. They had a roof over their heads, food in their refrigerator, and clothes to wear. But they were certainly struggling, existing in the precarious space between stability and crisis that characterized so many families in their neighborhood. Jake had begun to understand that his role in their family extended beyond helping with household tasks and childcare. He'd become the family's early warning system, the one who noticed when Sophie seemed more anxious than usual, when Carmen's exhaustion crossed the line from tired to overwhelmed, when their financial situation required creative solutions to avoid disaster. This hypervigilance had made Jake acutely aware of other families in their apartment complex who were facing similar challenges. Mrs. Chen in apartment 1C, whose husband worked night shifts while she cared for their elderly mother and 2 young children. The Rodriguez family in apartment 3A, where the teenage daughter often babysat her 3 younger siblings while both parents worked multiple jobs. The Johnsons in apartment 2D, where the father had been laid off from the manufacturing plant and was struggling to find work that paid enough to support his family. Jake had begun to realize that their apartment complex was filled with families like his own, hard-working people doing their best to provide for their children despite systemic challenges that made stability difficult to achieve. This recognition had fostered in Jake a deep sense of community responsibility, an understanding that their well-being was interconnected with the well-being of their neighbors. As autumn deepened into early winter, Jake noticed that Sophie's asthma seemed to be bothering her more frequently. The old heating system in their apartment building was inadequate, leaving their unit chronically cold and damp. Sophie's cough had become more persistent, and Jake had started keeping her inhaler closer at hand, worried about the possibility of a serious attack when he was the only one home to help her. The morning everything changed started like any other. Jake woke before his alarm, prepared his mother's coffee, and went through their established routine with Sophie. But as they were getting ready for school, Sophie's cough seemed worse than usual, and Jake noticed she was breathing more shallowly than normal. "Sophie, do you need your inhaler?" Jake asked, already reaching for her backpack where they kept the rescue medication. Sophie nodded, her small hand going to her chest in the gesture Jake had learned to recognize as a sign that her breathing was becoming labored. Jake helped her use the inhaler, counting the puffs the way the nurse at the free clinic had taught him, watching carefully to make sure Sophie's breathing improved. The inhaler helped, but not as much as usual. Sophie's breathing remained slightly labored, and Jake made the decision to keep her home from school, knowing that Carmen would understand, even if it meant missing work to care for their daughter. Jake called Mel's diner from their apartments. Landline, explaining to the manager that Sophie was having an asthma attack and that Carmen might need to come home. The manager's response was less than sympathetic. Carmen had already missed 2 shifts in the past month due to Sophie's previous health issues, and they were running out of patience with her absences. When Carmen arrived home 40 minutes later, her face was tight with worry and frustration. She'd left work in the middle of the breakfast rush, knowing it might cost her the job they desperately needed, but unable to ignore the fear in Jake's voice when he'd called. Sophie's condition had worsened while they waited for Carmen to return. Her breathing had become more labored, and she was having trouble speaking in full sentences. Carmen took one look at her daughter and made the decision Jake had been hoping she would avoid. They needed to take Sophie to the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital. The problem was that they didn't have a car, and an ambulance would cost money they didn't have. Carmen made the difficult choice to call Mrs. Henderson, hoping their neighbor would be willing to drive them to the hospital. Linda Henderson didn't hesitate, gathering her own children and driving the Martinez family to Riverside General, her presence providing comfort during what had become a genuinely frightening situation. The emergency room at Riverside General was crowded and understaffed, the kind of public hospital that served families who couldn't afford private health care. Sophie's asthma attack was serious but not life-threatening, and they waited for 3 hours before seeing a doctor who confirmed what Jake had already suspected. Sophie's asthma was being aggravated by environmental factors in their apartment, particularly the poor air quality caused by their building's inadequate heating system. The doctor prescribed stronger medication and recommended follow-up care with a pulmonologist. But Jake could see the stress in his mother's face as she calculated the cost of prescription medications they couldn't afford and specialist appointments their insurance might not cover. That evening, as Sophie slept peacefully for the first time in days thanks to her new medication, Carmen and Jake sat at their kitchen table having the kind of adult conversation that had become too common in their household. "I might lose my job," Carmen said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and worry. "Missing work today, missing the other days when Sophie was sick. They're running out of patience." Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the burden of being 12 years old but needing to think like someone much older. "What can we do?" he asked, though he was already formulating plans, already thinking through options and solutions. Carmen looked at her son, seeing in his face the premature maturity that broke her heart even as she relied on it. "I don't know, mijo. I really don't know." That night, Jake lay awake long after Sophie's breathing had settled into the peaceful rhythm of healthy sleep, long after Carmen had finally allowed herself to rest. He was thinking about their options, about the resources available to families like theirs, about the safety net that seemed to have so many holes that people like them could fall through despite doing everything right. Jake had no way of knowing that in just 2 days, their situation would deteriorate in ways he couldn't have imagined, that his ability to protect his family would be tested beyond anything a 12-year-old should have to endure. He couldn't foresee the crisis that would force him to make the most important decision of his young life, carrying his bleeding sister through the cold streets of Riverside toward the police station that represented their last hope for help. For now, he was just a 12-year-old boy, listening to his 6-year-old sister breathe, grateful that she was safe and healthy, unaware that their world was about to change in ways that would test every skill he'd developed, every instinct he'd honed, every ounce of courage he possessed. The clock on their kitchen wall ticked toward midnight, marking the end of another day in their carefully constructed routine, the last normal day they would have for a very long time. The next morning brought news that would reshape their entire world. Carmen stood by the kitchen counter, her phone pressed to her ear, her face growing paler with each word from the voice on the other end. Jake watched from the breakfast table, where he was helping Sophie eat her cereal, his 12-year-old instincts already recognizing the conversation as one that would change everything. "I understand," Carmen said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Yes, I know I've missed several shifts. No, I don't have anyone else who can watch her when she's sick." Sophie looked up from her cereal, sensing the tension in her mother's voice even though she couldn't understand the words. Jake reached over and gently touched her hand, a gesture that had become automatic whenever their family faced uncertainty. Carmen ended the call and stood motionless for several seconds, staring at her phone as if it might offer some solution to what had just occurred. When she finally turned to face her children, Jake could see she was struggling to maintain the composure that had carried them through so many previous crises. "Mommy?" Sophie asked, her 6-year-old voice carrying the worry that children absorb from their parents even when they don't understand the source. Carmen sat down at the table, reaching for both of her children's hands. "I lost my job at Mel's," she said simply. "They said they need someone who can be there consistently, and with Sophie's asthma getting worse, I've missed too many days." Jake felt the familiar sensation of the world shifting beneath him, the feeling he'd learned to recognize as the moment when their carefully constructed stability crumbled and required rebuilding. But at 12, he'd also learned that panic was a luxury they couldn't afford, that someone had to remain calm and focused when crisis struck. "What does this mean?" Jake asked, though he was already calculating in his head how long their savings might last, what expenses they could eliminate, what resources might be available to help them survive until Carmen found new employment. "It means we need to figure out our next steps," Carmen replied, her voice gaining strength as she shifted into the survival mode that had sustained them through previous challenges. "I'll start looking for work today. There are other restaurants, other businesses that might need help." But Jake could see the doubt in his mother's eyes, the recognition that finding employment in Riverside's limited job market would be difficult, especially when her recent firing would make potential employers hesitant to hire her. Most service industry jobs in their area required complete availability, something Carmen couldn't offer with 2 children and no reliable childcare options. The immediate crisis was financial, but Jake understood that their problems extended far beyond money. Without Carmen's income, they would struggle to pay rent, buy groceries, and afford Sophie's increasingly expensive asthma medications. The safety net they'd constructed through careful budgeting and Jake's small contributions from his work at Mr. Rossi's market would be inadequate to support their basic needs. That afternoon, while Carmen visited potential employers throughout Riverside, Jake found himself in an adult conversation with Mrs. Henderson that illustrated how quickly their situation had deteriorated. Linda Henderson had offered to watch Sophie while Carmen job hunted, a kindness that Jake appreciated even as it highlighted their family's growing dependence on neighbors' charity. "Jake, is everything okay at home?" Mrs. Henderson asked as they sat in her kitchen while Sophie played with Tyler and Emma in the living room. "Your mom seemed pretty stressed this morning." Jake faced the familiar dilemma of how much truth to share with well-meaning adults who wanted to help but might not understand the complexity of their situation. Too little information might prevent Mrs. Henderson from offering assistance they desperately needed. Too much might trigger interventions that could separate their family or create problems Carmen wasn't prepared to handle. Mom lost her job. Today, Jake said carefully. She's looking for something new, but it might take some time. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened with sympathy and concern. Is there anything I can do to help? I know things have been tight for your family. Jake appreciated the offer, but he also recognized that the Hendersons were struggling with their own financial challenges. Linda's freelance graphic design work provided irregular income, and her husband Mark had been laid off from his job at the manufacturing plant 6 months earlier. Their kindness was genuine, but their resources were limited. We'll be okay, Jake said, the response he'd perfected for situations like this. Mom's really good at finding solutions. But privately, Jake was beginning to understand that their current crisis might be different from the previous challenges they'd weathered. Carmen's job loss wasn't just an inconvenience or temporary setback. It was a fundamental threat to their ability to remain housed, fed, and together as a family. That evening, Carmen returned home with applications from 7 different businesses, but her expression suggested that the job market in Riverside was even more challenging than they'd hoped. Most positions required experience she didn't have, or availability she couldn't provide. The few opportunities that seemed promising paid significantly less than her job at Mel's had provided, creating a gap between their expenses and potential income that seemed impossible to bridge. How did it go? Jake asked, as Carmen collapsed onto their couch with the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day walking between businesses, filling out applications, and trying to present herself as the ideal candidate, despite circumstances that made employment complicated. I filled out a lot of paperwork, Carmen replied, her voice carrying a forced optimism that Jake recognized as her attempt to shield him and Sophie from the full weight of their situation. A few places said they might have openings in the next couple of weeks. Jake nodded, but he could see the stress lines around his mother's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she sorted through the business cards and contact information she'd collected. At 12, he'd become expert at reading the signs that indicated when their family's situation was moving from manageable to critical. Over the next week, their circumstances deteriorated with frightening speed. Carmen's job search yielded 2 interviews, but no job offers. Both potential employers expressing concern about her recent firing and her inability to guarantee consistent availability. The bills on their kitchen counter accumulated red stamps with increasing frequency, and Jake noticed Carmen staying awake later each night, sitting at the table with her calculator and a pile of papers, trying to stretch their dwindling resources across expenses that remained constant despite their reduced income. Sophie, with the intuitive awareness that children develop when their families are under stress, began exhibiting signs of anxiety that worried Jake. She'd started having trouble sleeping, often waking up with nightmares that she couldn't or wouldn't describe. Her appetite decreased, and she'd begun clinging to Jake with an intensity that suggested she sensed their world was becoming less stable. "Jake, are we going to have to move?" Sophie asked one afternoon as they walked home from school. The question caught him off guard, though he realized she'd probably overheard fragments of the increasingly desperate phone conversations Carmen had been having with their landlord. "I don't know," Jake replied honestly, recognizing that Sophie deserved truth even when the truth was frightening. "Mom's working really hard to make sure we can stay here." Sophie nodded solemnly, her small hand reaching for Jake's as they continued walking. At 6, she was beginning to understand that their family faced challenges that other families in her class didn't experience, that the stability she'd taken for granted was more fragile than she'd realized. Jake's work at Mr. Rossi's market had become more crucial than ever. his small earnings now representing a significant portion of their household income. Frank Rossi, with the perception that came from decades of serving struggling families, had begun offering Jake additional hours and slightly higher pay, gestures of support that he presented as business decisions rather than charity. "You're getting stronger, Jake," Mr. Rossi would say, as Jake unloaded delivery trucks and organized inventory. "I can give you more responsibility, pay you like the reliable worker you are." Jake treasured these affirmations, but he also understood that his earnings, while helpful, were insufficient to solve their family's fundamental problems. At 12, working 15 hours per week at minimum wage, he could contribute perhaps $60 to their household budget. Meaningful support, but nowhere near enough to replace Carmen's lost income. The crisis that would change everything began on a Tuesday evening in early November. Jake was helping Sophie with her homework at their kitchen table, while Carmen prepared a dinner of rice and beans, one of the inexpensive meals that had become standard as their food budget tightened. The apartment was cold, their heating bill having been reduced to the minimum payment that would prevent service disconnection, leaving them bundled in sweaters and blankets even indoors. Sophie had been coughing intermittently throughout the day, but Jake had attributed it to the cold weather and the poor air quality in their apartment building. Her rescue inhaler had provided relief during previous episodes, and there was no reason to think this situation would be different. But as they worked on Sophie's math homework, Jake noticed that her cough was becoming more frequent and more severe. She was having trouble concentrating on her worksheets, pausing frequently to catch her breath in a way that made Jake's stomach tighten with worry. "Sophie, do you need your inhaler?" Jake asked, already reaching for her backpack where they kept the rescue medication. Sophie nodded, her small hand going to her chest in the gesture Jake had learned to recognize as a sign that her breathing was becoming labored. But when Jake retrieved the inhaler and helped Sophie use it, the medication seemed to have less effect than usual. Her breathing remained rapid and shallow, and Jake could see the fear in her eyes as she struggled to get enough air. Carmen, hearing the sound of Sophie's distressed breathing, immediately stopped cooking and rushed to the table. One look at her daughter told her that this episode was more serious than the previous ones they'd managed at home. "We need to get her to the hospital," Carmen said, her voice tight with the controlled panic of a parent facing a medical emergency with limited resources. The problem was the same one they'd faced during Sophie's previous asthma attack. They had no car and no money for an ambulance. Carmen's first instinct was to call Mrs. Henderson, but when she dialed their neighbor's number, there was no answer. The Hendersons had mentioned something about visiting Mark's family for a few days, leaving Carmen without her usual support system. Jake watched his mother's face as she tried to think of alternatives, could see her mentally cycling through the limited options available to them. Calling 911 would bring an ambulance, but the cost would be astronomical and would likely trigger questions about their insurance coverage and ability to pay. Taking the bus to the hospital would be slow and potentially dangerous given Sophie's condition. Sophie's breathing became more labored as they deliberated, her small body working harder and harder to get the oxygen she needed. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, could hear the wheeze in her chest that indicated her airways were constricting despite the rescue medication. "I'll carry her," Jake said suddenly, the words coming from some deep place of determination he didn't know he possessed. "The hospital is only 8 blocks away. I can carry her faster than we can wait for help." Carmen started to protest, but another look at Sophie's condition made her realize that Jake's suggestion might be their best option. Sophie was small for her age, and Jake was strong from his work at Mr. Rossi's market. 8 blocks was a manageable distance if they moved quickly. "Are you sure you can do this?" Carmen asked, her voice carrying both desperation and hope. Jake nodded, already calculating the route in his head, already preparing himself for what would be the most important journey of his young life. He helped Sophie put on her warmest jacket, made sure her inhaler was in his pocket, and lifted his sister into his arms with as much confidence as he could muster. Sophie wrapped her arms around Jake's neck, her breathing still labored, but her trust in her big brother, absolute. "It's going to be okay, Sophie," Jake whispered as they prepared to leave the apartment. "I'm going to get you help." The November air hit them like a physical force as they stepped outside, cold and sharp in a way that made Sophie's breathing even more difficult. Jake had estimated that he could carry his sister 8 blocks, but he hadn't factored in the impact of cold air on her compromised respiratory system or the way fear would make his own body feel heavier and less coordinated. Carmen walked beside them, her face tight with worry as she watched Sophie's condition and monitored Jake's ability to carry her. By the 3rd block, Jake's arms were beginning to ache, and Sophie's breathing had become more desperate, her small body struggling against the combination of asthma and cold air. "Maybe we should call 911, Carmen said, pulling out her phone with hands that shook from more than just the cold. But Jake could see the hospital in the distance now, its emergency room lights glowing like a beacon in the gathering darkness. "I can make it," he said, adjusting his grip on Sophie and pushing forward with determination that surprised him. By the 6th block, Sophie's breathing had become so labored that Jake could feel her entire body working with each attempted breath. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that terrified him, and her grip around his neck had loosened in a way that suggested she was losing consciousness. Jake began to run, his 12-year-old legs carrying both him and his sister with a speed born of desperation and love. Carmen ran beside them, her voice calling out encouragement and reassurance that Jake wasn't sure either of them believed. The emergency room entrance loomed ahead, but Sophie had gone completely limp in Jake's arms, her breathing so shallow that he could barely detect it. Panic gave Jake a final burst of energy, carrying him through the automatic doors and into the bright fluorescent lighting of Riverside General's emergency department. "Help us!" Jake shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "My sister can't breathe!" Medical staff immediately surrounded them, taking Sophie from Jake's arms and rushing her toward treatment rooms while shouting medical terminology that Jake didn't understand but recognized as urgent. Jake collapsed into a chair in the waiting area, his arms aching and his heart pounding from the combination of physical exertion and emotional terror. Carmen wrapped her arms around Jake, both of them watching as medical professionals worked to stabilize Sophie's breathing. The next hour passed in a blur of forms, questions, and updates from nurses who gradually delivered better news. Sophie's breathing was improving, the emergency medication was working, she was going to be okay. Dr. Torres, the emergency room physician who had treated Sophie, finally emerged to speak with Carmen and Jake. His expression was serious but not grim, the look of a doctor who had good news to deliver but concerns to address. "Sophie is stable now," Dr. Torres said, sitting down across from them in the waiting area. "But this was a severe asthma attack, much worse than what you've dealt with before. Her airways were dangerously constricted." Carmen nodded, relief and worry competing in her expression. What caused it to be so much worse this time? Dr. Torres consulted his clipboard, his expression thoughtful. "Several factors, probably. Cold weather can trigger severe attacks in children with asthma, but I'm also concerned about environmental factors in your living situation. Poor air quality, mold, inadequate heating. These can all make asthma much worse over time." Jake listened to this explanation with growing understanding. Their apartment building's heating problems weren't just making them cold, they were making Sophie sick. The damp, poorly ventilated conditions that they'd learned to tolerate were actually dangerous for his sister's health. "What do we need to do?" Carmen asked, though Jake could see in her face the recognition that Dr. Torres' recommendations would likely involve expenses they couldn't afford. Sophie needs to see a pulmonologist for comprehensive asthma management, Dr. Torres replied. She'll need stronger daily medications to prevent attacks like this. And honestly, you need to consider whether your current living situation is safe for a child with severe asthma. The weight of these recommendations settled over Carmen and Jake like a heavy blanket. Better medical care would require insurance coverage they didn't have and specialist fees they couldn't afford. Finding a healthier living situation would require resources that were already stretched beyond their limits. Jake found himself thinking about the 8 blocks he'd carried Sophie, about the moment when her breathing had become so labored that he'd thought he might lose her. At 12 years old, he'd been forced to make decisions about his sister's life that no child should have to make, and he'd learned that love and determination sometimes weren't enough to solve the problems their family faced. That night, as Sophie slept peacefully in her hospital bed with the help of stronger medications, Jake sat in the chair beside her and began to understand that their situation had moved beyond what they could manage alone. Their family needed help, real help, from people with resources and authority to address problems that were bigger than what a 12-year-old boy and his struggling mother could solve on their own. Jake didn't know then that within 48 hours he would face an even more serious crisis, one that would require him to run through the streets of Riverside, carrying his bleeding sister, seeking help from the police department that represented their community's last safety net. He couldn't foresee the events that would test every skill he'd developed, every instinct he'd honed, every ounce of courage he'd discovered within himself. For now, he was just a brother sitting beside his sleeping sister, grateful that she was breathing easily, unaware that their hardest test was still ahead of them. Sophie came home from the hospital with a bag full of medications and a list of instructions that seemed to require constant vigilance. Carmen had managed to negotiate a payment plan for the emergency room visit, but the financial strain was evident in the way she stared at the prescription bottles, calculating costs they couldn't afford for medicines Sophie couldn't live without. Jake watched his mother's face as she read through Dr. Torres' discharge instructions, could see her mentally cycling through their limited options. The stronger daily medication Sophie needed would cost nearly $200 per month. Even with the patient assistance program the hospital social worker had helped them apply for. The recommended air purifier for their apartment cost another $150, and the follow-up appointment with the pulmonologist would require a specialist copay they didn't have. "We'll figure it out," Carmen said, but Jake could hear the doubt in her voice, could see the way her hands trembled as she organized Sophie's new medication schedule. The emergency room visit had solved the immediate crisis, but had created new problems that seemed even more insurmountable than the ones they'd faced before. Sophie, still weak from her hospital stay, seemed smaller than usual as she sat on their couch wrapped in blankets. Her breathing easier now, but her energy depleted from the trauma her body had endured. Jake positioned himself next to her close, enough to monitor her condition, but careful not to make her feel like an invalid. At 6 years old, Sophie was beginning to understand that her body worked differently from other children's, that normal activities could become dangerous for her in ways she couldn't predict or control. The next few days established a new routine, centered around Sophie's medical needs. Jake learned to help her use a nebulizer, a breathing treatment that required 15 minutes of sitting still while medication was delivered directly to her lungs. He memorized the schedule for her daily medications, understanding which ones prevented attacks and which ones provided emergency relief. Carmen adjusted her job search to accommodate Sophie's increased need for supervision, further limiting her employment options in a market that was already difficult to navigate. But their financial situation continued to deteriorate with frightening speed. Carmen's unemployment benefits provided some income, but far less than what they needed to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and Sophie's expensive medications. Jake's earnings from Mr. Rossi's market had become crucial to their survival, his $60 per week now representing a significant portion of their total household income. Jake found himself taking on even more responsibility, not just for Sophie's care, but for managing their household's increasingly complex logistics. He learned to stretch their grocery budget by buying rice and beans in bulk, to negotiate with utility companies for payment extensions, to research free or low-cost resources for families in crisis. At 12 years old, he was developing skills that most adults never needed to master, becoming expert at navigating systems designed to help families like his, but often too complicated or underfunded, to provide meaningful assistance. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in late November. Jake was at Mr. Rossi's market, stocking shelves and trying to focus on work despite his constant worry about Sophie, when his phone rang with a call from their home number. Carmen's voice was tight with panic when he answered. "Jake, I need you to come home right away," she said, her words rushed and breathless. "Sophie's having trouble breathing again, and I can't find her rescue inhaler." Jake's blood went cold. Sophie's rescue inhaler was supposed to be in her backpack, in the kitchen drawer where they kept emergency supplies, and in Carmen's purse. 3 locations that ensured they'd always have access to the medication that could save Sophie's life during an asthma attack. If Carmen couldn't find any of the inhalers, it meant their emergency backup system had failed at the worst possible moment. Jake ran the 6 blocks from Mr. Rossi's market to their apartment, his heart pounding with fear and his mind racing. Through possibilities. Maybe Carmen had overlooked one of the inhalers in her panic. Maybe Sophie's attack wasn't as severe as it sounded. Maybe they could get her to the hospital in time even without the rescue medication. But when Jake burst through their apartment door, he could see immediately that the situation was more serious than he'd hoped. Sophie was sitting on the couch, her small body leaning forward in the position that indicated severe breathing difficulty, her lips showing the bluish tinge that meant she wasn't getting enough oxygen. Carmen was frantically searching through drawers and bags, her movements becoming more desperate as she failed to locate any of the inhalers they'd thought were safely stored throughout their apartment. "I don't understand," Carmen said, her voice breaking with frustration and terror. "They were here yesterday. I checked them yesterday." Jake immediately began his own search, but with growing dread as he realized that all 3 rescue inhalers had somehow disappeared from their usual locations. Without the emergency medication, Sophie's asthma attack would continue to worsen, her airways constricting until she couldn't breathe at all. "Call 911, Jake said. But Carmen was already dialing, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate her phone. The emergency dispatcher's voice was calm and professional as she gathered information about Sophie's condition and their address. An ambulance would be dispatched immediately, but the estimated arrival time was 12 to 15 minutes, time that Sophie might not have as her breathing became more labored with each passing moment. Jake knelt beside his sister, trying to remember everything he'd learned about helping someone through an asthma attack without medication. He encouraged Sophie to stay calm, to focus on slow, controlled breathing, to remain upright in the position that would help her airways stay as open as possible. But he could see the fear in her eyes, could hear the wheeze in her chest that indicated her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Carmen hung up with the emergency dispatcher and immediately began calling neighbors, hoping someone might have an inhaler they could borrow or transportation that could get them to the hospital faster than waiting for the ambulance. But the Henderson family was still out of town, and the other neighbors Carmen reached either weren't home or didn't have the resources to help. Sophie's breathing became more desperate, her small body working harder and harder to get the oxygen she needed. Jake could see her energy failing, could watch as the effort of breathing consumed all her strength and left her unable to speak. or move. The bluish tinge around her lips was becoming more pronounced, and Jake realized with growing terror that they were watching his sister suffocate in slow motion. "The ambulance will be here soon," Carmen said, but her voice carried no conviction, and Jake could see that she was beginning to panic in a way that would make the situation worse for Sophie. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Sophie needed help immediately, and waiting for the ambulance might mean waiting too long. The hospital was 8 blocks away, the same distance he'd carried her before, but this time, Sophie's condition was more severe and deteriorating more rapidly. "I'm taking her to the hospital," Jake announced, already moving to lift Sophie from the couch. Carmen started to protest, but another look at Sophie's condition made her realize that Jake's plan might be their only option. Sophie was small enough for Jake to carry, and he'd proven during their previous emergency that he could cover the distance to Riverside General Hospital. But as Jake lifted Sophie into his arms, he immediately noticed differences from their previous emergency. Sophie was more limp this time, her body not responding the way it had before. Her breathing was so shallow that Jake could barely detect it, and her skin felt cold, despite the fever that often accompanied severe asthma attacks. "Call the hospital," Jake instructed Carmen as they prepared to leave. "Tell them we're coming. Tell them it's Sophie Martinez and she can't breathe." Carmen nodded, grabbing her phone and following Jake toward the door. But as they reached the threshold of their apartment, Sophie's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. Her breathing, already desperately shallow, became almost imperceptible, and her body went completely limp in Jake's arms. Jake felt panic rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain focused. Sophie needed help now, not in 15 minutes. When the ambulance might arrive, not in 10 minutes if they waited for other solutions to materialize. She needed help immediately, and Jake was the only one who could provide it. He began running, carrying his sister through the hallway of their apartment building and out into the cold November air. Carmen ran beside him, her phone pressed to her ear as she tried to coordinate with the hospital's emergency department while keeping pace with her 12-year-old son, who was carrying her dying daughter through the streets of Riverside. The first block passed in a blur of terror and determination. Sophie's breathing was so shallow that Jake wasn't sure she was still alive, but he could feel her heart beating against his chest, a faint rhythm that told him to keep moving, keep running, keep fighting for his sister's life. By the second block, Jake realized that something was wrong with Sophie's condition beyond just the asthma attack. Her skin felt different, colder than it should be, and there was a stillness to her body that suggested something more serious was happening. But Jake didn't have time to analyze what he was observing. He could only focus on covering the distance to the hospital as quickly as possible. The third block brought a new crisis. Sophie's body suddenly convulsed in Jake's arms, a violent movement that nearly caused him to drop her. When the convulsion ended, Jake noticed something that made his stomach clench with terror. There was blood on Sophie's shirt, bright red against the pale fabric. Jake stopped running for a moment, trying to understand what he was seeing. The blood seemed to be coming from Sophie's mouth, but Jake couldn't tell if she'd bitten her tongue during the convulsion, or if something more serious was happening internally. All he knew was that his sister was bleeding, unconscious, and possibly dying in his arms. Carmen caught up to them, her face going white when she saw the blood on Sophie's clothing. "What happened?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of their labored breathing. "I don't know," Jake replied. But he was already moving again, running faster now with the knowledge that Sophie's condition had moved beyond asthma attack into something that required immediate medical intervention. The fourth and fifth blocks passed in a nightmare of growing desperation. Sophie's breathing had become so faint that Jake couldn't detect it, and the blood on her shirt was spreading, creating a stain that seemed to grow larger with each step. Jake found himself running faster than he'd ever run before. his 12-year-old body pushed beyond its normal limits by the knowledge that his sister's life depended on his speed and endurance. Carmen was falling behind, her own breathing labored, as she struggled to keep pace while maintaining her phone conversation with the hospital. Jake could hear fragments of her conversation, descriptions of Sophie's condition, requests for the emergency team to be ready, pleas for help that carried the desperation of a mother watching her child die. By the 6th block, Jake's arms were screaming with pain, but Sophie's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was no longer sure she was alive. Her body was completely limp, her breathing undetectable, and the blood on her shirt had soaked through to stain Jake's own clothing. He was carrying what might already be his sister's lifeless body, but he couldn't stop running, couldn't accept that he might be too late. The 7th block brought them within sight of Riverside General Hospital, its emergency room lights visible in the distance like a beacon of hope. Jake pushed himself harder, his legs carrying him and Sophie with a speed born of desperation and love. Behind him, Carmen was shouting into her phone, coordinating with the medical team that would hopefully be waiting for them. The 8th and final block required every ounce of strength Jake possessed. His arms were numb from carrying Sophie's weight, his legs were trembling with exhaustion, and his lungs burned from the cold air and exertion. But the hospital entrance was directly ahead, and Jake could see medical personnel waiting outside, alerted by Carmen's phone call and prepared to take Sophie immediately into treatment. Jake reached the hospital entrance at a full run, his momentum carrying him through the automatic doors and into the bright fluorescent lighting of the emergency department. Medical staff immediately surrounded them, taking Sophie from Jake's arms and rushing her toward treatment rooms while shouting medical terminology that Jake didn't understand but recognized as urgent. "She stopped breathing," Jake gasped, collapsing against the wall as adrenaline gave way to exhaustion. "There was blood, and she had a convulsion, and I couldn't find her inhaler." Dr. Torres, the same physician who had treated Sophie during their previous visit, was among the medical team working to stabilize her condition. Jake watched through the treatment room window as doctors and nurses connected Sophie to machines, administered medications, and performed procedures that looked both terrifying and hopeful. Carmen arrived a few minutes later, her face streaked with tears and her breathing labored from the run. She wrapped her arms around Jake, both of them watching as the medical team worked to save Sophie's life, both of them understanding that Jake's decision to carry his sister to the hospital had been the only thing that stood between Sophie and death. "You saved her life," Carmen whispered, her voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "If you hadn't carried her here, if you'd waited for the ambulance..." Jake nodded, but he was focused on the activity in Sophie's treatment room, trying to read the expressions on the medical staff's faces for signs of hope or despair. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Dr. Torres emerged. From the treatment room, his expression serious but not grim. "Sophie is stable now," Dr. Torres said, sitting down across from Carmen and Jake in the waiting area. "But this wasn't just an asthma attack. She had what we call status asthmaticus, a severe, prolonged attack that didn't respond to normal treatment. Without immediate intervention, it could have been fatal." Carmen reached for Jake's hand, both of them understanding how close they'd come to losing Sophie, how crucial Jake's decision to carry her to the hospital had been. "The blood you saw was from the stress of severe breathing difficulty," Dr. Torres continued. "It's not uncommon in cases this severe, but it's definitely frightening to witness. The important thing is that you got her here in time." Jake felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, the adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis finally beginning to fade. He'd saved his sister's life, but the experience had also shown him how vulnerable their family was, how quickly normal problems could become life-threatening emergencies when they lacked resources and support systems. "What happens now?" Carmen asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that this crisis was part of a larger pattern. They couldn't continue to manage alone. Dr. Torres's expression became more serious. Sophie needs to be admitted for observation and comprehensive treatment. But beyond that, we need to have a conversation about your family's living situation and resources. These severe attacks are often triggered by environmental factors, and they're becoming more frequent and more dangerous. Jake listened to this conversation with growing understanding. Their apartment's poor air quality wasn't just making Sophie uncomfortable, it was creating conditions that could kill her. Their inability to afford proper medical care wasn't just inconvenient, it was putting his sister's life at risk in ways that would only get worse over time. That night, as Sophie slept in her hospital bed connected to monitors that tracked her breathing and heart rate, Jake sat in the chair beside her and began to understand that their family had reached a turning point. They'd survived this crisis, but barely, and only because Jake had been willing and able to carry Sophie 8 blocks through the streets of Riverside. The next crisis might be different. Sophie might be alone when it happened, or Jake might not be strong enough to carry her, or the hospital might be too far away. Their family needed help, real, systematic help that addressed the root causes of their problems, rather than just the emergencies those problems created. Jake didn't know then that within 24 hours, he would face a situation that would require him to seek help from the police department, carrying his bleeding sister through the streets of Riverside one more time in search of the assistance their family desperately needed. He couldn't foresee the events that would finally connect them with the resources and support systems that could address their problems comprehensively, rather than just treating the crises those problems generated. For now, he was just a brother, sitting beside his sleeping sister, grateful that she was alive, beginning to understand that love and determination, while necessary, weren't sufficient to solve the challenges their family faced. They needed help, and Jake was starting to realize that asking for help wasn't a sign of failure, it was a sign of wisdom, courage, and love. Sophie spent 3 days in the hospital under observation, her room filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the quiet efficiency of nurses who had seen too many children in similar conditions. Jake rarely left her bedside, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair that converted into something resembling a bed, taking on the role of Sophie's advocate and protector even within the supposedly safe walls of Riverside General Hospital. Carmen alternated between the hospital and the outside world, trying to manage the crisis that Sophie's hospitalization had created in their already fragile existence. Missing work to stay with Sophie had cost Carmen 2 job interviews, and the hospital bills were accumulating with frightening speed, despite the social worker's assistance with payment plans and charity care applications. Jake watched the adults around them with the heightened awareness he'd developed over the past months, reading expressions and conversations for clues about what would happen to their family once Sophie was discharged. The doctors spoke in careful, professional language about Sophie's need for environmental modifications and comprehensive asthma management. But Jake understood that they were really talking about money. Money for medications they couldn't afford. Money for housing that didn't make Sophie sick. Money for the kind of stability that would prevent future emergencies. Dr. Torres visited Sophie's room each morning during his rounds, his interactions with Jake revealing a growing recognition that the 12-year-old boy understood more about his sister's condition than most adults would. Jake had memorized Sophie's medication schedule, learned to read the monitors that tracked her oxygen levels, and developed an intuitive sense of when Sophie was having trouble breathing before the machines registered the changes. "You're very observant," Dr. Torres told Jake during one of these visits. "You notice things about Sophie's condition that even experienced medical professionals sometimes miss." Jake nodded, accepting the compliment while recognizing the burden it represented. His hypervigilance regarding Sophie's health had become both a survival skill and a source of constant anxiety. He couldn't stop analyzing every cough, every change in breathing pattern, every sign that might indicate another crisis was developing. The social worker assigned to their case, Ms. Rachel Kim, spent considerable time talking with Carmen about their living situation and resources. Jake listened to these conversations from Sophie's bedside, understanding that Ms. Kim was trying to help, but also recognizing that the solutions she suggested, subsidized housing applications, Medicaid enrollment, food assistance programs, may involved bureaucratic processes that could take months to navigate, while their immediate problems required solutions measured in days or weeks. The waiting list for subsidized housing in Riverside is 18 months, Ms. Kim explained to Carmen during one of their meetings. But I can help you apply for emergency assistance, and there might be temporary housing options available through local churches or community organizations. Carmen nodded, but Jake could see the defeat in her expression, the recognition that even well-intentioned help often moved too slowly to address the urgency of their situation. Sophie needed a healthy living environment immediately, not after months of bureaucratic processing and waiting lists. On Sophie's third day in the hospital, Jake overheard a conversation between Dr. Torres and Ms. Kim that made his stomach clench. With worry, they were discussing Sophie's discharge, but their tone suggested concerns that extended beyond her immediate medical needs. Her home environment is clearly contributing to the severity of these attacks, Dr. Torres was saying. The mold, the poor ventilation, the inadequate heating. It's not safe for a child with severe asthma. Ms. Kim's response was carefully measured, but Jake caught the implications immediately. We have to balance the child's medical needs with the family's circumstances. Sometimes temporary placement in foster care is necessary when the home environment poses immediate health risks. Jake felt his world tilt sideways. Foster care meant separation from Sophie, meant their family being broken apart by systems that were supposedly designed to help them. He'd heard stories from other kids at school about what happened when social services got involved, about families that were separated and never reunited, about children who disappeared into a system that was overwhelmed and underfunded. That evening, after Carmen had gone home to shower and collect clean clothes, Jake sat beside Sophie's bed and tried to process what he'd learned. Sophie was recovering well from her asthma attack, but her discharge from the hospital might trigger events that would destroy their family in different but equally devastating ways. Sophie, who had been mostly quiet during her hospitalization, seemed to sense Jake's anxiety. "Jake, are we in trouble?" she asked, her 6-year-old voice carrying the wisdom that children develop when they've lived through too many adult crises. Jake considered how to answer, recognizing that Sophie deserved honesty, but also needed reassurance. "Some people are worried about whether our apartment is making you sick," he said carefully. "They want to make sure you stay healthy." Sophie nodded solemnly, her small hand reaching for Jake's. "I don't want to live somewhere else. I want to stay with you and Mommy." The simplicity of Sophie's statement cut through all the complex discussions Jake had been hearing from the adults around them. Sophie didn't need environmental modifications or comprehensive asthma management. She needed to stay with her family while they found solutions to the problems that threatened her health and their stability. That night, Jake made a decision that would change the trajectory of their crisis. Instead of waiting for the adults to decide their family's fate, he would take action to demonstrate that they were capable of solving their problems with appropriate support, rather than family separation. Jake had been thinking about Detective Sarah Coleman, the police officer who had spoken to his class about community safety and resources. Detective Coleman had given each student her business card, encouraging them to reach out if they ever needed help with problems that seemed too big to handle alone. At the time, Jake had filed the card away without thinking he'd ever need it, but now it represented a potential connection to help that might be different from the bureaucratic systems that moved too slowly to address their urgent needs. The Next morning, while Carmen was meeting with the hospital's billing department, Jake called Detective Coleman from the phone in Sophie's room. His hands trembled as he dialed, but his voice was steady when she answered. "Detective Coleman, this is Jake Martinez from Mrs. Patterson's 6th grade class at Lincoln Elementary. You gave us your card and said to call if we needed help." Detective Coleman's voice immediately became more focused, the professional but caring tone that Jake remembered from her classroom visit. "Of course, Jake, what's going on?" Jake took a deep breath and began explaining their situation. Sophie's severe asthma, their apartment's poor air quality, Carmen's job loss, the mounting medical bills, and most importantly, the social worker's suggestion that Sophie might need to be placed in foster care for her own safety. Detective Coleman listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions that showed she understood both the immediate crisis and the underlying problems that had created it. When Jake finished his explanation, there was a moment of silence that made him worry he'd made a mistake in calling. "Jake, you did exactly the right thing by calling me," Detective Coleman finally said. "This is exactly the kind of situation where our family resource team can help. Can you give me your address and phone number? I'm going to make some calls and see what options we have." Jake provided the information, feeling a mixture of hope and terror. He'd taken action to protect his family, but he'd also involved law enforcement in their situation, which could lead to consequences he hadn't anticipated. Detective Coleman arrived at the hospital 2 hours later, accompanied by Officer James Park, who specialized in family crisis intervention. Jake had been expecting the interview to focus on their problems, but Detective Coleman's first questions were about Sophie's recovery and the family's immediate needs. "How is Sophie feeling today?" Detective Coleman asked, sitting beside Sophie's bed with the easy manner of someone accustomed to talking with children in crisis. Sophie, initially shy around the uniformed officers, warmed up quickly to Detective Coleman's genuine interest in her rock collection and her plans for when she left the hospital. Jake watched this interaction with growing appreciation for Detective Coleman's approach. She was gathering information about their family's situation, but she was doing it in a way that made Sophie feel important and heard rather than scrutinized and judged. "Jake tells me you're having some problems with your apartment making Sophie sick," Detective Coleman said to Carmen when she returned from her meeting with the billing department. Carmen's initial response was defensive, the instinctive reaction of a parent who'd been criticized for circumstances beyond her control. But Detective Coleman's manner was collaborative rather than accusatory, focused on problem-solving rather than blame assignment. "I've been in touch with some community resources that might be able to help," Detective Coleman continued. "There's a program through the Riverside Community Foundation that provides emergency housing assistance for families dealing with medical crises. It's not permanent, but it could give you time to find a healthier living situation for Sophie." Jake felt a surge of hope as Detective Coleman outlined various possibilities: emergency housing assistance, expedited Medicaid enrollment, connections to employers who offered flexible schedules for parents with children who had chronic medical conditions. These weren't the same bureaucratic processes that Ms. Kim had described, but immediate interventions that could address their crisis while longer-term solutions were developed. "The most important thing," Detective Coleman said, "is keeping your family together while we work on these challenges. Sophie needs her family, and you've all proven that you're committed to her well-being." Carmen's eyes filled with tears, the relief of finding someone who understood that their problems required support rather than family separation. "I've been so scared that they were going to take Sophie away from us," she whispered. Detective Coleman's expression became more serious. "That's not going to happen unless it's absolutely necessary for Sophie's immediate safety. And from what I can see, Sophie is safest with people who love her and understand her needs, which means staying with you and Jake. Over the next several hours, Detective Coleman and Officer Park coordinated with various community resources to create an immediate action plan for the Martinez family. The Riverside Community Foundation approved emergency housing assistance that would allow them to move to a temporary apartment with better air quality. A local church offered to help with moving expenses and household supplies. Mr. Rossi, when contacted about Jake's situation, not only agreed to hold Jake's job, but offered to increase his hours and pay to help the family during their transition. Dr. Torres, when informed about these developments, modified his discharge plan for Sophie to include close monitoring and support services rather than the environmental restrictions that had seemed impossible to implement. Ms. Kim, initially skeptical about the rapid coordination of resources, became enthusiastic about the collaborative approach that addressed multiple aspects of the family's crisis simultaneously. Sophie was discharged from the hospital on a Friday afternoon, leaving with a comprehensive treatment plan, adequate medication, supplies, and most importantly, a safe place to live while their family stabilized and planned for the future. Jake carried Sophie's belongings to the car that Detective Coleman had arranged for their transportation, marveling at how quickly their situation had changed once they'd connected with people who had both the authority and the commitment to provide meaningful help. The temporary apartment was small but clean, with functioning heat and good ventilation that wouldn't aggravate Sophie's asthma. Jake helped Sophie explore their new space, both of them amazed by simple things like windows that opened properly and a bathroom without mold growing around the fixtures. "Jake, did you really call the police to help us?" Sophie asked as they unpacked her clothes in the bedroom they would share. Jake nodded, still processing the events that had transformed their crisis into a manageable challenge. "I remembered Detective Coleman saying that we should call if we needed help with problems that seemed too big to handle alone." Sophie considered, this with the seriousness that 6-year-olds brought to important conversations. "Were you scared to call her?" "Yes," Jake admitted, "but I was more scared of what might happen if I didn't." That evening, as their family settled into their temporary home, Carmen prepared dinner in a kitchen that had adequate ventilation and working appliances. Sophie played quietly with her rock collection, her breathing easy and unlabored in the cleaner air. Jake finished his homework at a table that wasn't covered with unpaid bills and crisis management paperwork. For the first time in months, their apartment felt like a home rather than a crisis management center. Sophie's medications were organized in a clean, dry location where they would remain effective. Carmen had job interviews scheduled with employers who understood that parents of children with chronic medical conditions sometimes needed flexibility. Jake could focus on being a 6th grader rather than a crisis manager, though he retained the skills and awareness that had carried his family through their most difficult period. Detective Coleman visited them that evening, checking on their transition and finalizing arrangements for ongoing support services. She found the Martinez family eating dinner together at their table, a scene of normalcy that represented the successful intervention of community resources working collaboratively rather than bureaucratically. "How does the apartment feel for Sophie's breathing?" Detective Coleman asked, though she could already see the answer in Sophie's relaxed posture and clear speech. "Much better," Carmen replied. "She hasn't needed her rescue inhaler since we moved in." Detective Coleman smiled, but her expression also carried the seriousness of someone who understood that this success story required ongoing effort to maintain. The emergency housing assistance lasts for 6 months, which should give you time to get established in employment and find permanent housing that meets Sophie's medical needs. Jake listened to this conversation with the maturity that his experiences had forced him to develop, understanding that their current stability was temporary, but confident that his family now had access to the resources and support systems they needed to build something more permanent. "Detective Coleman," Jake said, "thank you for believing that we could solve our problems if we had help." Detective Coleman looked at Jake with the respect that adults rarely showed to 12-year-olds, recognizing in him the strength and wisdom that Crisis had developed. "You saved your sister's life, Jake, multiple times. You proved that your family deserves support, not separation." That night, Jake lay in bed listening to Sophie's easy breathing in the clean air of their temporary apartment, thinking about the journey that had brought them from crisis to stability. He'd learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. That community resources existed for families like his if they could find the right connections. And that love, combined with appropriate support, could overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable when faced alone. Jake didn't know then that their story would inspire changes in how Riverside's community resources coordinated their efforts, that Detective Coleman would use their case as a model for family crisis intervention, or that his courage in seeking help would eventually benefit other families facing similar challenges. For now, he was just a brother listening to his sister breathe easily, grateful for the safety and stability they'd achieved, ready to face whatever challenges might come, with the knowledge that they didn't have to face them alone. In the temporary apartment's clean air, with adequate heat and working appliances, the Martinez family slept peacefully for the first time in months, their crisis transformed from insurmountable emergency into manageable challenge through the simple act of asking for help from people who had both the resources and the commitment to provide meaningful assistance. The worst was behind them, though Jake couldn't know that their success story was just beginning, that their experience would create ripple effects throughout Riverside's community support systems, helping other families avoid the crises that had nearly destroyed their own family before the right help arrived at exactly the right time. 3 weeks into their stay at the temporary apartment, Jake began to notice changes in his family that went beyond Sophie's improved breathing and Carmen's reduced stress levels. Sophie had started sleeping through the night without nightmares. Her appetite had returned to normal, and she'd begun talking about school projects and friends with the enthusiasm of a healthy 6-year-old. Carmen had secured a position at a small accounting firm that offered flexible hours and health insurance benefits, work that utilized skills she'd developed during her years of managing their family's complex finances under impossible circumstances. Jake found himself adjusting to a new role within their family dynamic, one that maintained his protective instincts towards Sophie while allowing him to reclaim some of the childhood experiences he'd sacrificed during their crisis. His work at Mr. Rossi's market continued, but now it represented spending money and college savings rather than emergency survival funds. His grades had improved as his chronic worry about family stability diminished, allowing him to focus on academic challenges that were appropriate for a 12-year-old rather than the adult responsibilities he'd shouldered out of necessity. Detective Coleman visited them regularly during those first weeks, monitoring their transition and connecting them with additional resources as needs became apparent. Her approach had evolved from crisis intervention to family advocacy, helping the Martinez family navigate systems that were designed to help but often moved too slowly or required expertise that struggling families didn't possess. During one of these visits, Detective Coleman brought news that would change their long-term prospects significantly. "I've been working with the Riverside Community Foundation on a new program," she explained to Carmen and Jake over coffee at their kitchen table. "It's designed to provide stable, affordable housing for families with children who have chronic medical conditions." Jake listened with the focused attention he'd developed for conversations that might affect their family's future, understanding that Detective Coleman was describing an opportunity that could provide the permanent stability they'd been seeking. The program works with local landlords to identify properties that meet specific health and safety standards. Detective Coleman continued. Rent is subsidized based on income, and there's ongoing support for maintenance and repairs that keep the unit safe for children with medical needs. Carmen's face showed a mixture of hope and caution, the expression of someone who'd learned not to trust opportunities that seemed too good to be true. What would we need to do to qualify? Detective Coleman smiled, recognizing Carmen's wariness as a reasonable response to their previous experiences with bureaucratic systems that promised help but delivered complications. The Martinez family has already been approved. Sophie's medical needs, your employment status, and Jake's demonstrated maturity in managing family crises make you exactly the kind of family this program was designed to help. Jake felt a surge of excitement mixed with disbelief. Stable housing had been the foundation of all their other problems. The poor air quality that triggered Sophie's asthma attacks, the financial strain of rent that consumed most of Carmen's income, the constant worry about eviction that had made long-term planning impossible. There's a 2-bedroom unit available in the Oak Street complex, Detective Coleman said, pulling out photographs that showed a clean, well-maintained apartment with modern appliances and large windows that would provide good air circulation. For Sophie, it's within walking distance of Lincoln Elementary, 3 blocks from Mr. Rossi's market and 2 miles from Carmen's new job. Sophie, who had been quietly coloring at the table while the adults talked, looked up with the excitement that children showed when they sensed good news they didn't fully understand. "Are we getting a new home?" she asked, her voice carrying the hope that had been building during their weeks in the temporary apartment. "We might be, baby girl," Carmen replied, but Jake could see tears forming in her eyes, the emotional release of someone who'd carried the weight of housing insecurity for too long. The application process for the subsidized housing program was surprisingly straightforward, managed by social workers who understood that families in crisis needed assistance navigating bureaucracy rather than additional barriers to overcome. Jake accompanied Carmen to the interviews and paperwork sessions, his presence providing moral support and also demonstrating to program administrators the family's commitment to stability and success. During one of these meetings, Jake found himself in conversation with Mrs. Angela Torres, the program coordinator, who would monitor their family's progress and provide ongoing support services. Mrs. Torres had reviewed their case file and was impressed by Jake's role in managing family crises and seeking appropriate help. "You showed remarkable maturity in contacting Detective Coleman," Mrs. Torres told Jake. "Many adults in similar situations don't know how to access community resources effectively." Jake accepted the compliment while recognizing that his skills had been developed out of necessity rather than choice. "I learned that asking for help isn't giving up," he said. "It's just admitting that some problems are bigger than what one family can solve alone." Mrs. Torres nodded, making notes in Jake's file that would become part of their family's permanent record with the housing program. That's exactly the kind of insight that makes families successful in long-term stability programs. The move to their permanent apartment took place on a Saturday in early December with help from Detective Coleman, Officer Park, Mr. Rossi, and several members of the church congregation that had assisted with their initial transition. Jake carried Sophie's belongings to their new home, marveling at the differences between this move and their previous relocations that had been driven by crisis rather than opportunity. Sophie's new bedroom had large windows that opened to let in fresh air, a closet large enough for her growing collection of clothes and toys, and most importantly, walls that didn't show signs of mold or water damage. Jake's room was smaller but comfortable, with space for a desk where he could do homework without competing for table space with bill paying or crisis management activities. Carmen stood in the kitchen of their new apartment, opening and closing, Cabinet doors with the wonder of someone who'd lived too long in spaces that were adequate at best. The appliances were modern and efficient, the ventilation system worked properly, and there was enough storage space for groceries and household supplies that could be purchased in reasonable quantities rather than day-by-day survival portions. "Jake, come look at this," Sophie called from the living room, where she'd discovered that their new apartment had a small balcony overlooking a playground where children from the complex played after school. Jake joined Sophie on the balcony, both of them watching children their own ages playing games that required no adult supervision or crisis management. For the first time in months, Jake could imagine Sophie participating in normal childhood activities without the constant worry about her breathing or their family's stability. That evening, their first in the permanent apartment, the Martinez family established new routines that reflected their changed circumstances rather than crisis. Management needs. Carmen prepared dinner in a kitchen that had adequate counter space and functioning appliances. Sophie completed her homework at a table that wasn't covered with bills or emergency paperwork. Jake worked on a science project that required space to spread out materials and time to focus on academic challenges appropriate for his age. Detective Coleman stopped by during their first week in the new apartment, officially checking on their transition, but really participating in a celebration of their family's journey from crisis to stability. She found them settled into routines that looked remarkably normal for a single-parent family with 2 children. Their apartment filled with the comfortable chaos of people who had space for possessions and activities beyond basic survival. "How is Sophie's breathing in the new apartment?" Detective Coleman asked, though she could already see the answer in Sophie's energetic description of her new school friends and after-school activities. "She hasn't needed her rescue inhaler since we moved in," Carmen reported. "The doctor says her lung function tests are the best they've been since she was diagnosed with asthma." Detective Coleman smiled, but her expression also carried the satisfaction of someone who'd seen community resources work the way they were designed to work when properly coordinated and adequately funded. "What about you, Jake? How are you adjusting to not having to manage family crises?" Jake considered the question carefully, recognizing that his role in their family had evolved rather than disappeared. "I still worry about Sophie and Mom," he said. "But now I worry about normal things, like whether Sophie will make friends and whether I'll do well on my math test. It's different kind of worry." Detective Coleman nodded, understanding that Jake's hypervigilance and premature maturity wouldn't disappear overnight, but could be redirected toward age-appropriate concerns and challenges. "Have you thought about what you want to do when you grow up?" Jake's answer surprised him as much as Detective Coleman. "I want to help other families like ours. I want to learn how to connect people with resources before they reach crisis points." Carmen looked at her son with the mixture of pride and concern that parents felt when they recognized exceptional qualities in their children that might lead to both opportunities and burdens. Jake's experiences had given him insights into family crisis management that few adults possessed. But those same experiences had also forced him to mature in ways that she sometimes regretted. "There are lots of ways to help families," Detective Coleman said. "Social work, community development, public health, law enforcement, medicine, education. All of these fields need people who understand what families really need when they're struggling." Jake nodded, filing away this information for future consideration, while focusing on the immediate reality of being a 12-year-old boy whose family had achieved stability after months of crisis. His future career choices could wait. For now, he was content to experience the normalcy they'd worked so hard to achieve. As winter deepened into spring, the Martinez family's life in their new apartment settled into patterns that reflected security rather than survival. Sophie's asthma remained manageable, with proper medication and a healthy living environment, allowing her to participate in school activities and develop friendships with children who didn't know about her previous medical crises. Carmen's job at the accounting firm had evolved into a position with increasing responsibility and better benefits, providing financial stability that allowed for planning beyond immediate needs. Jake's role in their family had transformed from crisis manager to typical older brother, though he retained the observational skills and problem-solving abilities that had carried them through their most difficult period. His grades had improved significantly as his mental energy became available for academic challenges rather than survival planning. He joined the school's peer mediation program, using his understanding of family dynamics and crisis resolution to help other students navigate conflicts and challenges. During Sophie's routine medical checkup in early spring, Dr. Torres remarked on the dramatic improvement in her condition since their family had achieved stable housing. "Sophie's lung function is completely normal now," he told Carmen and Jake. "Her asthma is well controlled, and I don't anticipate any of the severe attacks she experienced when you were living in poor environmental conditions." Jake listened to this medical assessment with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned that systematic solutions to underlying problems were more effective than crisis management responses to emergencies. Their family's health and stability had improved not because they'd become better at handling crises, but because they'd addressed the root causes that had created those crises. Detective Coleman continued to check on the Martinez family periodically, but her visits had evolved from crisis intervention to friendship and mutual professional respect. Jake's insights into family crisis dynamics had proven valuable for her work with other families, and she'd begun consulting with him informally about cases that involved children taking on adult responsibilities due to family circumstances. "You have a gift for understanding what families really need," Detective Coleman told Jake during one of these consultations. "Most adults see the symptoms of family crisis, but you see the underlying problems that create those symptoms." Jake accepted this observation while recognizing that his understanding had been purchased at a cost he wouldn't have chosen to pay. His experiences had given him valuable insights, but they'd also required him to sacrifice aspects of childhood that couldn't be recovered. The key was using those experiences constructively rather than allowing them to define limitations for his future. On the anniversary of Sophie's first severe asthma attack, the Martinez family celebrated with a dinner at their favorite restaurant, a tradition that marked their journey from crisis to stability while acknowledging the challenges they'd overcome together. Sophie, now 7 years old and healthy, chatted about her second-grade achievements and summer camp plans with the confidence of a child who expected good things to happen in her future. Carmen, now established in her career and financially secure, watched her children with the contentment of a parent who'd successfully navigated impossible circumstances while keeping her family together. Her struggles had led to skills and resilience that served her well in her professional life. But more importantly, they deepened her appreciation for the stability and opportunities her children now enjoyed. Jake, now 13 and entering 8th grade, had developed into a young man whose maturity and compassion reflected his experiences while embracing the possibilities that stability had created for his future. His story had become part of Riverside's community narrative, an example of how family crisis could be transformed into community strength when resources were properly coordinated and genuinely supportive. "What do you think would have happened if you hadn't called Detective Coleman?" Sophie asked Jake as they walked home from the restaurant, her question reflecting the kind of retrospective thinking that children used to understand their own histories. Jake considered Sophie's question carefully, recognizing that their family's success story had required not just his courage in seeking help, but also the existence of community resources and people committed to providing meaningful assistance. "I think we would have kept struggling until something really bad happened," he said honestly. "But the important thing is that we did ask for help, and help was available when we needed it." Sophie nodded, satisfied with this explanation while also absorbing the lesson about the importance of seeking help when problems became too big to handle alone. At 7, she was developing her own understanding of how families worked, how communities supported each other, and how individual courage could create positive change for multiple people. That night, as Jake helped Sophie with her bedtime routine, in their stable, healthy home, he reflected on the journey that had brought them from crisis to security. His family had not only survived their challenges, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to their community than they'd been. Before their difficulties began, the skills Jake had developed during their crisis, observation, problem-solving, advocacy, resource navigation, had become assets rather than burdens as his family achieved stability. His understanding of how systems worked and how to access help effectively had made him a valuable resource for other families facing similar challenges. As Sophie settled into sleep in her comfortable bedroom with its good air quality and adequate heating, Jake completed his homework at his own desk, in his own room, no longer needing to compete for space or manage family crises while trying to focus on academic responsibilities. Their apartment was quiet with the contentment of people who had enough food, enough warmth, enough medical care, enough stability to plan for futures that extended beyond immediate survival. Jake's story had become part of Riverside's community success stories, an example of how individual courage combined with systematic support could transform family crisis into community strength. But for Jake himself, the most important outcome was simpler. His sister could breathe easily, his mother could sleep peacefully, and their family could focus on growing and thriving rather than merely surviving from one crisis to the next. 2 years had passed since the Martinez family's crisis had transformed into stability, and Jake Martinez was now 15 years old, a sophomore at Riverside High School, who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned early that challenges could be overcome with the right combination of courage, persistence, and community support. His experiences had shaped him into a young man whose maturity and compassion drew both peers and adults to seek his advice on problems that seemed insurmountable to them, but manageable to someone who'd navigated genuine crisis. Sophie, now 8 years old and thriving in 3rd grade, had grown into a vibrant child whose asthma was so well controlled that her condition rarely interfered with normal activities. She participated in school sports, spent afternoons playing with friends in their apartment complex's playground, and had developed into a confident student whose teachers praised her empathy and helpfulness toward classmates who struggled with various challenges. Carmen had been promoted to senior accountant at her firm, her skills in managing complex financial situations under pressure having proven invaluable in her professional life. The family's financial stability had allowed them to build savings, plan for Sophie's future medical needs, and even begin setting aside money for Jake's college education, goals that had seemed impossible during their crisis period, but now felt achievable through steady progress and careful planning. Their apartment had become a true home, filled with the comfortable accumulation of possessions that reflected interests and hobbies rather than just basic survival needs. Sophie's rock collection had evolved into a serious geological hobby, with specimens carefully labeled and displayed throughout her room. Jake's desk was equipped with a computer that allowed him to pursue academic interests and maintain the peer counseling blog he'd started to help other teenagers navigate family challenges. Detective Coleman had become a family friend whose visits were social rather than professional, though she continued to value Jake's insights into family dynamics and crisis intervention strategies. Jake had become an unofficial consultant for the Riverside Police Department's Family Services Unit, helping officers understand how children experience family crises and what kinds of interventions were most likely to preserve family stability. While addressing genuine safety concerns, "Jake, I want to talk to you about an opportunity," Detective Coleman said during one of her visits that spring. "The state is developing a new program for peer crisis counselors, and they're looking for young people with experience helping families navigate challenging situations." Jake listened with the focused attention he'd maintained for conversations that might affect his future, understanding that Detective Coleman was describing an opportunity that could shape his career path while allowing him to help other families avoid the kind of crisis his own family had experienced. The program would provide training in crisis intervention, family systems, and community resources, Detective Coleman continued. Participants would work with social workers and police officers to help families connect with appropriate assistance before situations become emergency-level crises. Carmen, who had been listening from the kitchen while preparing dinner, joined the conversation with the interest of a parent whose child was being offered opportunities that could define his future direction. What would this involve for Jake? Would it interfere with school or his other responsibilities? Detective Coleman shook her head, understanding Carmen's concerns about Jake taking on too much responsibility at a young age. The program is designed to complement rather than compete with normal teenage activities. Training would happen during summer months, and the actual counseling work would be part-time and carefully supervised. Jake felt excitement building as he considered the possibilities Detective Coleman was describing. His experiences with family crisis had given him skills and insights that could help other families, but he'd never imagined those abilities could become part of a formal career path while he was still in high school. "He'd like to learn more about it," Jake said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm he felt for work that would allow him to make a meaningful difference in other people's lives. Over the following weeks, Jake learned that the peer crisis counseling program was part of a broader initiative to address family challenges through community-based interventions, rather than bureaucratic systems that often move too slowly to prevent crises from becoming emergencies. The program had been developed based on research showing that families in crisis often responded better to help from people who'd experienced similar challenges than to assistance from professionals who understood problems theoretically but lacked practical experience. The application process was comprehensive, requiring essays about Jake's experiences with family crisis, interviews with program coordinators, and recommendations from adults who could speak to his maturity and problem-solving abilities. Detective Coleman, Carmen, Dr. Torres, and even Mr. Rossi provided letters of support that described Jake's character, his insights into family dynamics, and his ability to remain calm and focused during challenging situations. Jake's acceptance into the program came with a scholarship that would cover training costs and provide a small stipend for his work with families, recognition that peer counselors brought valuable skills that deserved compensation rather than being treated as volunteer charity work. The program coordinators had been impressed by Jake's combination of personal experience with family crisis and his ability to articulate insights that could help both families and professionals better understand how to provide effective assistance. The summer training program brought together 20 teenagers from across the state who demonstrated exceptional ability to help families navigate challenging circumstances. Jake found himself part of a group that included young people who'd experienced various types of family crises: economic hardship, medical emergencies, parental addiction, domestic violence, immigration challenges, but who'd all developed skills in crisis management, resource navigation, and family advocacy. What we have in common explained Dr. Maria Santos, the program director, is not just that you've experienced family challenges, but that you've learned to transform those experiences into strengths that can help other people. That transformation is what makes effective peer counselors. Jake listened to Dr. Santos with the recognition that came from hearing his own experience, described in terms that made sense of the journey his family had traveled. The skills he'd developed during their crisis hadn't just helped them survive. They'd prepared him to help other families avoid similar emergencies by connecting them with resources and support systems before situations became desperate. The training covered crisis intervention techniques, family systems theory, community resource mapping, and ethical guidelines for peer counseling relationships. But what impressed Jake most was how the program balanced professional knowledge with respect for the lived experiences that had brought each participant to the training. Their personal insights were treated as valuable expertise rather than problems to be overcome or backgrounds to be transcended. During one training session focused on recognizing signs of family crisis, Jake found himself sharing the story of how he'd learned to read his mother's stress levels and Sophie's health indicators, skills that had allowed him to anticipate problems and take preventive action. His observations about how children responded to family instability helped the other participants understand dynamics they'd experienced but hadn't been able to articulate. Children often become the family's early warning system, Jake explained to the group. We notice changes in routines, stress levels, and family dynamics because we're dependent on stability in ways that make us hyper-aware of threats to that stability. Dr. Santos nodded, making notes that would become part of the training materials for future peer counselor cohorts. How did you learn to distinguish between normal family stress and crisis-level problems? Jake considered the question carefully, recognizing that his ability to make those distinctions had developed gradually through experience rather than formal instruction. I think it was when normal solutions stopped working, he said. When Mom's usual ways of managing problems weren't enough anymore, when Sophie's breathing got worse despite following medical instructions, when our safety net kept getting smaller instead of bigger. The other participants in the training program shared similar insights, their collective experiences creating a comprehensive understanding of how families moved from stability to crisis and what kinds of interventions were most likely to prevent that progression. Jake realized that his family's story wasn't unique. Many families face similar challenges with limited resources and inadequate support systems. But their successful resolution of those challenges could provide hope and practical guidance for others. As the training program progressed, Jake began working with actual families under careful supervision, applying the skills he'd learned while drawing on his personal understanding of family crisis dynamics. His first case involved the Henderson family, ironically the same neighbors who'd helped his own family during their difficult period, but who were now facing their own challenges as Mark Henderson's unemployment had stretched beyond their financial reserves. Jake's role wasn't to solve the Henderson family's problems, but to help them identify resources and develop strategies that could address their challenges before they reached crisis levels. His familiarity with community resources, combined with his understanding of how pride and fear could prevent families from seeking help, allowed him to connect the Hendersons with assistance in ways that felt supportive rather than charity-based. The trick, Jake explained to Tyler and Emma Henderson during one of their family meetings, is learning that asking for help isn't admitting failure. It's admitting that some problems are bigger than what one family can handle alone, and that's not a weakness, it's just reality. Tyler, now 10 years old, listened to Jake with the attention that children gave to slightly older peers who seemed to understand their experiences. Were you scared when your family had problems? Jake nodded, appreciating Tyler's directness and recognizing the anxiety behind the question. I was terrified. But I learned that being scared doesn't mean you can't do what needs to be done. Sometimes being scared means you're paying attention to real problems that need real solutions. Working with the Henderson family allowed Jake to see his own family's crisis from a different perspective, understanding how their struggles had affected not just themselves, but their entire community. Mrs. Henderson had worried about the Martinez family during their difficult period, but hadn't known how to help beyond offering occasional assistance. Now Jake could help her family access resources more effectively, while also strengthening the community connections that made everyone more resilient. The peer counseling program proved remarkably successful, with participating families showing significantly better outcomes than those who received traditional social services interventions. The combination of practical resource navigation and emotional support from people who'd experienced similar challenges created a more effective approach to family crisis prevention than either professional services or peer support could provide alone. Jake's work with families expanded beyond the Henderson case to include several other families in Riverside who were facing various challenges. He helped the Rodriguez family navigate their daughter's learning disability diagnosis and connect with educational resources. He worked with the Chen family to address elder care challenges that were straining their finances and family relationships. He assisted the Johnson family in finding employment resources and childcare options that would allow both parents to work while maintaining family stability. Each case taught Jake something new about family dynamics, community resources, and the complex interplay between individual problems and systemic challenges. He began to understand that effective family support required not just crisis intervention, but also advocacy for policy changes that would address the root causes of family instability: inadequate healthcare access, housing affordability, employment insecurity, and educational inequality. During his junior year of high school, Jake's work with the peer counseling program led to an invitation to speak at a statewide conference on family crisis intervention. Standing before an audience of social workers, police officers, healthcare providers, and policymakers, Jake shared his family's story and the insights he'd gained from helping other families navigate similar challenges. "The most important thing I've learned," Jake told the conference audience, "is that families don't fail because they lack love or commitment. They struggle because they lack resources, support systems, and access to help when problems are still manageable. If we can connect families with appropriate assistance before crises develop, we can prevent most of the emergencies that currently overwhelm our social services systems." The response to Jake's presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with several conference attendees requesting follow-up meetings to discuss how peer counseling programs could be implemented in their communities. Jake found himself becoming a spokesperson for approaches to family support that emphasized prevention, community connection, and respect for families' own problem-solving abilities. Sophie, now 9 years old and completely healthy, had become proud of her brother's work helping other families, though she sometimes missed the days when Jake's attention was focused primarily on their own family's needs. During one of their regular brother-sister conversations, she asked Jake whether he ever regretted the experiences that had led to his current work. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if we'd never had those problems," Jake admitted. "Maybe I would have been more focused on sports or video games, more like other kids my age." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, her 9-year-old perspective shaped by her understanding of how their family's challenges had ultimately led to positive outcomes. "But then you wouldn't be able to help other families the way you do now. And maybe some of them would have really bad things happen to them." Jake smiled, recognizing the wisdom in Sophie's observation. Their family's crisis had been genuinely difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it had also created opportunities for service and impact that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The key was ensuring that other families could access support and resources without having to experience the same level of crisis that had been necessary to get help for his own family. Carmen watched her children's conversation with the mixture of pride and protectiveness that characterized her approach to parenting teenagers who'd experienced more adult responsibilities than most of their peers. Jake's maturity and compassion were sources of pride, but she also worried about whether he was taking on too much responsibility for other people's problems at an age when he should be focused on his own development and future planning. Jake, are you sure this counseling work isn't interfering with your own goals and interests? Carmen asked during one of their regular family discussions about balancing service to others with personal development. Jake considered his mother's question seriously, understanding her concerns while also feeling confident about his choices. The counseling work is helping me figure out what I want to do with my life, he said. I'm learning about social work, public policy, community development, and psychology all at the same time. It's not taking away from my education, it's adding to it in ways that make everything else more meaningful. Detective Coleman, who'd become a regular dinner guest and unofficial family mentor, supported Jake's involvement in the peer counseling program while also sharing Carmen's concerns about balance. The key is making sure Jake has opportunities to be a normal teenager too, she said. His experiences and insights are valuable, but he also needs time to develop interests that aren't related to family crisis and community service. Jake appreciated both his mother's protective instincts and Detective Coleman's wisdom about maintaining balance in his life. He joined the school's debate team, where his skills in analyzing complex problems and presenting persuasive arguments had made him a valuable contributor. He'd also developed friendships with classmates who valued his advice and perspective, but also encouraged him to participate in typical teenage activities like movies, sports events, and social gatherings. During his senior year of high school, Jake's work with the peer counseling program had expanded to include training other young people who wanted to help families in their communities. He'd developed curriculum materials based on his experiences, created resource guides for common family challenges, and mentored newer peer counselors who were just beginning to learn how personal experience could be transformed into professional skills. The success of Riverside's peer counseling program had attracted attention from other communities, with several cities requesting assistance in developing similar programs. Jake found himself traveling to conferences and training sessions across the state, sharing his expertise while also learning from the experiences of families and communities facing different but related challenges. Sophie's health had remained stable throughout Jake's high school years, her asthma completely controlled through proper medication and environmental management. She'd become an active, confident child whose medical history was apparent only to healthcare providers who reviewed her charts. Her success in school and social relationships provided ongoing evidence that their family's crisis intervention had been successful, not just in the short term, but in creating conditions for long-term thriving. Carmen's career had continued to advance, with her skills in financial management under pressure having led to opportunities in non-profit administration and community development finance. She'd begun working part-time with organizations that provided financial counseling and resource navigation for families facing economic challenges, using her own experiences to help others develop strategies for managing complex financial situations. As Jake's high school graduation approached, his future plans reflected the integration of his personal experiences with academic preparation and professional aspirations. He'd been accepted to several universities with strong social work and public policy programs, with scholarship support that recognized both his academic achievements and his demonstrated commitment to community service. The night before graduation, Jake sat on the balcony of their apartment with Sophie, both of them looking out at the playground where children from their complex played in the evening light. Their conversation ranged over the journey their family had traveled, from crisis to stability to service, acknowledging both the difficulties they'd overcome and the opportunities those challenges had created. "Do you think other families can learn from what we went through?" Sophie asked, her 9-year-old perspective shaped by understanding that their story had become part of something larger than their individual experience. Jake nodded, watching the children play games that required no adult supervision or crisis management. "I think the most important thing other families can learn is that asking for help isn't giving up. It's recognizing that some problems require more resources than any one family has, and that communities are strongest when everyone looks out for each other." Sophie considered this wisdom with the seriousness she brought to important conversations, and that kids can help solve problems too, not just cause them. Jake smiled, recognizing the insight behind Sophie's question. "Exactly. Kids often see solutions that adults miss because we're not worried about pride or embarrassment or whether something is the right way to solve a problem. We just focus on what works." Graduation day arrived with the mixture of celebration and transition that marked significant passages in family life. Jake walked across the stage to receive his diploma, while Carmen and Sophie cheered from the audience, their pride reflecting not just his academic achievements, but the journey they'd traveled together to reach this moment. Detective Coleman attended the graduation ceremony as well, her presence representing the community connections that had made their family's success possible. After the ceremony, she pulled Jake aside for a conversation that would provide closure to one chapter of his life while opening possibilities for the next. "I want you to know that your family's story changed how our department approaches family crisis intervention," Detective Coleman told Jake. "The peer counseling program you helped develop has prevented dozens of families from reaching the crisis point your family experienced. That's your legacy, even as you head off to college to learn new ways to help people." Jake felt the satisfaction that came from knowing his experiences had created positive change that extended beyond his own family's success. Their crisis had been genuinely difficult, but it had also generated insights and innovations that were helping other families avoid similar emergencies. As summer progressed and Jake prepared for college, the Martinez family spent time reflecting on their journey, while also planning for futures that were now filled with possibilities they couldn't have imagined during their crisis period. Sophie was thriving in school and developing interests in science and medicine that might eventually lead to careers helping other children with chronic medical conditions. Carmen was considering returning to school herself to formalize her expertise in family financial counseling and nonprofit management. Jake's departure for college in the fall would mark the end of his daily presence in their household, but his influence on their family's approach to challenges and opportunities would continue. He taught them all that problems could be solved through combination of courage, persistence, and willingness to seek appropriate help, lessons that would serve them well as they faced whatever challenges and opportunities their futures might bring. On Jake's last night at home before leaving for college, the Martinez family had dinner together at their kitchen table, the same location where they'd faced their darkest moments and celebrated their greatest victories. The conversation ranged over memories, hopes, and plans, acknowledging how far they'd traveled while also embracing the excitement of new adventures ahead. "I'm proud of who you've become, Jake," Carmen said, her voice carrying the emotion of a parent whose child had not only survived difficult circumstances, but had transformed them into strengths that would benefit many other people. Jake looked around the table at his family, Sophie, healthy and confident, calm and stable and successful, their apartment filled with the comfortable security of people who had enough, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they'd not only survived their challenges, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to their community than they'd been before their difficulties began. The next morning, as Jake loaded his belongings into Detective Coleman's car for the drive to college, Sophie handed him a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a rock from her collection, chosen specifically for Jake. A piece of quartz that had been formed under pressure and heat, but had emerged clear and strong. "So you remember that beautiful things can come from difficult situations," Sophie explained, her 9-year-old wisdom reflecting understanding that extended far beyond her years. Jake hugged his sister, recognizing in her gift a perfect symbol of their family's journey and his own transformation from crisis manager to community leader. Their story had begun with a 12-year-old boy carrying his sick sister through the streets seeking help. And it was ending with that same young man heading off to college with skills, insights, and commitment that would allow him to help many. Other families write their own stories of resilience, recovery, and hope. As they drove toward Jake's future, Detective Coleman shared one final observation about the Martinez family's impact on their community. "Your story proved that families don't need to be rescued," she said. "They need to be supported, respected, and connected with resources that allow them to solve their own problems. That understanding has changed how we approach every family crisis case that comes through our department." Jake nodded, understanding that their family's greatest achievement wasn't just their own success, but the way their experience had created better outcomes for other families facing similar challenges. Their crisis had become a catalyst for community change. Their recovery had become a model for family support, and their story had become hope for anyone who wondered whether difficult circumstances could be transformed into opportunities for service and impact. The car pulled away from Cedar Grove Apartments, carrying Jake toward a future filled with possibilities for learning, growing, and continuing the work of helping families transform their challenges into strengths. Behind him, Sophie waved from their balcony, while Carmen prepared for her own day of work that had grown out of their family's experiences with crisis and recovery. Their story had come full circle, from crisis to stability to service, proving that the most difficult experiences could become the foundation for the most meaningful contributions to other people's lives. And in communities across the state, other families were discovering that help was available, hope was possible, and that asking for assistance wasn't admitting defeat, but demonstrating the wisdom to recognize that some challenges required community solutions rather than individual struggle. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.